Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Charles Eisenstein. Charles is an author, activist, and public speaker. His work relates to the intersection of spirituality, ecology, economics, and the history of human civilization. His books include The Ascent of Humanity, Sacred Economics, Climate, A New Story, and The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. Our conversation ranges from understanding how human civilization developed to the point of crisis it's now in, through to what we can do to move into a more sustainable future. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, so I'm here with Charles Eisenstein. Charles, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here, James. Thank you for bringing me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. So in your work, your writing kind of shows this real depth of insight into what I see as the kind of root mechanisms of suffering and discord in the world. And for me, this kind of understanding only really comes about through real kind of lived experience. It has the signature of kind of hard-won personal wisdom. Was that the case for you?
Not really. I mean, not in any dramatic degree. I'm not one of the people who, battled stage 4 cancer or survived intense childhood abuse or anything like that. However, I think that in our civilization, there's a lot of trauma that has become so normalized that we don't recognize it as traumatic. And I have a very sensitive disposition. So, I've definitely experienced my share of inner turmoil, even if the outer circumstances might look, well, you had a pretty good childhood, Charles. You're quite privileged and you've never really suffered in your life. But that's a kind of judgment that is tempting to place on other people when you don't understand or don't even attempt to understand what it's like for them. Because, as we know, people who outwardly appear very fortunate, very privileged, very successful, they end up killing themselves in huge numbers. So that degree of inner turmoil, of anguish, is invisible. And so I guess what I'm saying is that, for one thing, I haven't experienced anything story-worthy, really, except to the extent that everybody has a story and a journey. So I would say the answer to your question maybe actually is yes, but no more than any other human being.
Right. But it sounds like there's, as you say, we all have our own stuff to work through, I guess. And it sounds like you've done that inner work on yourself and through that process, maybe gleaned insight into the mechanisms of suffering that can then be applied to things at a larger scale. And I think you're right that I guess I also detect in your work that you hold both of these perspectives, that there are differences between perhaps you and me, in a kind of relative privilege that exists. There are people who go through unbelievable trauma, but at the same time that everyone from their own side has their own story. No one gets away free, right, without any of this trauma.
Yeah, at our current historical juncture, unless you are born into one of the very, very few remaining uncontacted tribes in the Amazon or something. Everybody today is, or almost everybody, is born into some degree of the story of separation. If you live in a money economy, if you go to school, if you are scientifically educated, we're all touched by this story, by this wound, actually. We're born into separation, each of us in a different location in the tapestry of interwoven stories. And you could say maybe that our purpose in contribution to humanity's metamorphosis is to live out the particular story and to heal from the particular kind of separation that we're born into.
You mentioned the kind of this feeling of if you're born into one of the few remaining uncontacted tribes, and that being a place where perhaps you can escape this kind of systemic trauma. And that perspective is something I think I've always had from a young age. I have this vivid memory of being in the Natural History Museum in London when I was a kid, and being in the kind of evolutionary anthropology section with all the statues of kind of, early Homo sapiens, and having this really profound feeling of like, there was a time when we were healthy. I just had this intuition, must be about 10 years old, and I was like, and we're not there now. Like I had this strong need to understand right back from the beginning of kind of human evolution, like what were things like in the deep past, and also you could say, in places where today, where the kind of the story of separation, as you mentioned, hasn't played out. And that's kind of counter, I guess, to the mainstream narrative, which is that was, a life that was nasty, brutish and short, and we're very lucky to have escaped it. And this is, I guess, the kind of core of, in your first book, The Ascent of Humanity, right? This idea that we've been sold this story, or we live in the story of ascent, and it's all good and it's all progressing, but actually that's a kind of story of being deeply separate from the rest of the world and not really belonging.
Right. The only glitch in that story, so that's a countervailing story to the story of ascent, the story of the fall, that we were in this primitive state of harmony and oneness, and then something happened. And different radical authors identified this something in different ways, but usually it is domestication or patriarchy, or even representational language could be identified with the fall, because that's when we started categorizing and conceptually domesticating the world, setting the stage for the physical domestication of the world. And so you have all these theories about what happened, what bad thing happened that pushed us off course. But I think that this narrative has a critical flaw, because if we were in such a state of harmony and perfection, then why did we choose to go on this journey of horror that has been civilization? And also, it's true that this is not just a journey of horror. Incredible new forms of beauty have arisen because of civilization. And I think therein lies the key to the paradox, that on some level, we recognized, even the very wise people in hunter-gatherer Stone Age cultures, they recognized the necessity to go on the journey of separation, to unlock the full range of human potentials, and understood maybe that it was a risky journey, that it was we might never return to our state of wisdom and harmony, but we want to go on this journey, acquire all of the perceptions and skills and technologies and experiences and healing powers. Like maybe you have to descend deeply into illness in order to discover new forms of healing that then enrich the soul when it comes back. So maybe, either you have to believe that there's a inherent flaw in humanity that allowed us to go on the journey of separation to begin with, or you have to say, maybe this wasn't a big mistake after all. And the fact that so much beauty has arisen from civilization indicates to me that maybe we knew what we were doing all along, and that maybe today we are at a critical juncture where if we do not turn toward reunion, we will be lost forever and never bear these gifts back to source that we had been sent out to discover.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth lingering on that. We both were very quick to say that civilization has been a horror show, but it has these gifts, and I'm sure there'll be some people listening where that just doesn't resonate. They think civilization is just clearly, look at all this glorious stuff that we've created. Look at this technology we're talking to each other with now, and that's we obviously completely acknowledge that. But I think this is in that story, I guess the things that are wrong with the world, whether it's, ecological destruction or wealth inequality or climate change, all of those things are kind of, they have their local kind of causes,
Right.
in this kind of reductionist
You
way.
people would say those are not due to an inherent flaw in technology. Those are just because we haven't quite gotten it right yet.
Yeah, exactly. And whereas I think you and I have maybe a view that there's this kind of root issue, which maybe it's so buried in the past, or it's so interwoven into everything, and it's been going on since before written history even, that all of our religions, everything is so soaked in this particular trajectory that it's very hard to see. So I guess in this conversation, if someone's skeptical that there's anything deeply kind of wrong with civilization, or deeply, maybe I shouldn't say wrong, because you were saying maybe it wasn't a mistake, but something maybe pathological, or a source of suffering, a source of discord, then maybe we'll convince some people as we go forward.
There is this narrative, and this is what I call the Ascent narrative, that thanks to science, technology, reason, some extend it to free markets, liberal democracy, and so forth, the world is getting better and better. People like, what's his name? Steven Pinker. He's the most prominent exponent of this idea. And, he cites all kinds of statistics. The number of people who died in war has gone down in whatever recent decades. Crime, more people live in democracies. Infant mortality is much lower. Violence is on the decline. Per capita GDP is rising. Access to modern healthcare is improving. Lifespan has improved, and so forth. And so it looks like a very convincing case from the set of statistics that he's using. On the other hand, you can read the work, for example, of Weston A. Price, who was a dentist who traveled the world. I think it was in the 1910s and 1920s, maybe 1930s. He went and found people who lived very, very traditional lifestyles and ate traditional diets. And he went to like the Outer Hebrides. He went to Aboriginal tribes in Australia. He visited Polynesian islands, remote Swiss villages, he went all over the place. And what he found is that people who had not been touched by modernity had magnificent health, all 32 teeth with no tooth decay. He was a dentist, so he looked at that first. Easy childbirth, tremendous physical stamina. And he's like, wow, we have not gotten it right here. I personally have I spent my 20s living in Taiwan, which at the time, this starting in the 1980s, I went there and spent the 1990s there as well. And at the time, there were still people living in a very traditional way, using traditional Chinese medicine, doing traditional Chinese health practices, and whereas my uncle, who was 70, had just gotten a chairlift installed to get upstairs, there were these temples in the mountains that you could only reach by ascending 1,000 or 2,000 stone steps. And there'd be 80-year-olds up there. There'd be 90-year-olds up there. And then when we moved, our movers, one of the guys was 70 years old. He was working for a moving company. And I remember him carrying our refrigerator on his back down 2 flights of stairs. And he's the same age as my uncle at the time, who had a chairlift. And this is, an anecdote, of course, but from so many repeated observations, I became aware that this whole myth that the modern science of medicine and nutrition and that's supposedly making us healthier and healthier and healthier as we approach a utopia of the end of disease and so forth. Like this is not actually what's happening. And then you can look at, chronic diseases in our society, formerly rare conditions that are now rampant. So anyway, the Steven Pinker ideology of progress really requires that you only look at certain statistics and exclude other observations.
Right. I think especially those statistics, often if you're starting from kind of the Middle Ages or something, and you're saying things have got better since then, that's quite a narrow kind of window you're looking at, right? Instead of looking at kind of deep human history. And I think you're right, actually, that health is a really powerful thing to focus on when thinking about this stuff, because you might say, well, we've got more medicines than ever. We've got, these wonderful drugs we can use and in a reductionist framework, if you're thinking, I currently have depression and the antidepressant gives me relief, that seems convincing. That seems I want to live in that world. But then if you zoom out to the kind of systems view and you think, well, what if I lived in a world where from a very early age, I was so connected to others in like nurturing and love and to the world that I never got depressed in the first place, so it's a kind of, I guess, links to preventative medicine in that way as well.
Yeah. That's part of the pattern of the technological fix or the technical fix, where you use technology to address the conditions that have been caused by previous technology. So in the case of mental illness, depression, which has been rising and rising and rising, or you could say, oh, no, it hasn't. We're just diagnosing it more and treating it more, but people have always been this miserable. Well, so there's research on this, and what really the most important factor as that determines whether someone's happy or not is whether they're lonely, whether they're lonely or they're connected, whether they have a feeling of belonging, whether they have a feeling of doing something meaningful in their lives, whether they're connected to community, whether they're connected to nature. Well, it is precisely technology and economics that has dissociated modern human beings from community and from nature, to the point where nature becomes, for most people, a little more than a spectacle and not something that you really participate in with your body. So you can look at pretty scenery, but do you know the names of all of the trees and their uses? And do you have a relationship with those trees and with all the plants and with the animals? Are you embedded in that? For most modern people, the answer is no. Nor do you look at the people around you. And now, especially with COVID, this has reached a new extreme. Where you can't even look at the people around you. But even before COVID, you would look at your neighbors, look at the people that you see on the street every day or in a shop every day, or maybe you don't see them every day because they're just an employee and they get, rotated to somebody else's shift. But even if you do see them often, do you really know their story? Do you know them? Are they part of your life in multiple dimensions, not just the single dimension of customer and service provider? So this is actually a very new state of affairs. Human beings, for most of history and prehistory, were intimately connected to every person around them and every being around them. So this cutoff, which is, as I said, a product of technology and economy, creates the misery and the loneliness that then another technology is used to address. And here we are talking on Zoom, which is a technology that ameliorates some of the disconnection that is caused by modern living patterns. So the question then is, when we're addressing the Steven Pinker Ascent story, which of course way predates him. I mean, this is the dream of Descartes. Descartes wrote about this. He said, essentially, in that famous passage where he says that science is going to make us the lords and possessors of nature, he actually goes into quite some detail describing how technology is going to create a utopia world. So when we really look at, are we happier? Has it actually worked? has it delivered on its promise? It's really hard to maintain that doctrine of progress, especially if you go and visit, the Hadza or the Caro in Peru, or you spend some time in some villages in Ghana, and you see actually what happy people are. And I've heard a lot of stories like this from travelers who are like, wow, until I went to, visit this remote village, I never knew what a happy person even looked like. And so it's direct experiences like that, which could also come through, psychedelic medicine or through near-death experiences. I mean, there's many ways in which the truth can reach us. And it tells us that the normal state of being human that we've come to accept is quite a downgrade from what life could be. Yeah.
And I think you're right to mention psychedelic medicine, because kind of cutting edge neuroscience of thinking about depression informed by psychedelic medicine is now beginning to cast it to depression as a disorder of disconnection, really, and the antidote being the intense connection that one gets with the psychedelic experience of either feeling yourself to be deeply interconnected as a being, but also the kind of insights people get that they need to invest more in connection to nature or to family. So I think this, and obviously separation is what's happening when you're disconnected, right? You're stealing yourself off from the world. And it makes sense that there are these two sides to our being. I think you were saying earlier about, if we chose to go down this path, but I guess I think to exist as a living form is to have pulled apart from the rest of the world to some extent. Like relatively, you're still, in absolute terms, you're still the same thing as it, but there is some relative separation. And in order to kind of, for life to explore and do its thing, it needs to be there. And we've kind of tumbled down, there are benefits to separation, and we've tumbled down that strategy for a very long time. And I guess I'd be interested, maybe do you think there is a starting point to this story of separation, or is it just a feature of what we are from the very beginning?
Yeah, in the Ascent of Humanity, I half jokingly traced the story of separation back to its origin, because there's this idea among so-called anti-civilization intellectuals that the salvation of humanity requires undoing civilization. And how far back do you go? Do you reverse industry maybe and have an agrarian culture, or do you reverse domestication and live again as hunter-gatherers? Do you stop using representational language and only communicate by song and touch and intuition? I mean, this is like a core characteristic of Homo sapiens, to use language. And I said, actually, separation originated even before then. You could take it back to fire, which created a primeval self-other division. The circle of domesticity was the circle of the fire, and it gave us a mastery over other animals and changed our physiology too. So maybe we should, undo that and stop using fire. And what about tools? Stone tools, they artificially increase the carrying capacity of the land relative to human beings and give us a kind of a dominance over. Maybe we should stop using tools too and really go back to nature. And I'm like, this can't be right, especially animals use tools. Crows use tools. Chimpanzees use tools. So, and then, you could even take separation. I said, maybe we should overthrow the tyranny of the eukaryotic cell, which was a step of separation away from the prokaryotes, who promiscuously share their DNA with each other all the time. And then we started to selfishly keep all our DNA for ourselves in the nucleus and only share it in specific circumstances called sex. That we should undo that tyranny as well. And I did this kind of to point out the absurdity of attempting to go back to the past and to idealize that past, because it's actually a denial. It's a repudiation of nature's gift. It's a repudiation of the of nature's, I would even say, reality's innate tendency toward greater and greater complexity, toward greater and greater life, toward greater and greater beauty. Like, yeah, the eukaryotic cell was a step of separation, but it also allowed greater complexity and new forms of beauty. And the same thing is true of our human version of separation. Our ability to manipulate with our hands, to manipulate the world, our ability with our minds to see ourselves as separate from the world, like that allows forms of expression and new realms of complexity to emerge. So to repudiate that gift on a subtle level is the same kind of human exceptionalism that is, you could argue, is at the root of our ecologically destructive ways.
I think I completely agree that primitivism, like returning to some arbitrary point, is not the way forward. And it's, I guess, the way my instinct is that the problem isn't so much where we're at. The problem is our lack of awareness about what's happening. You know, so if one is individually being kind of governed by, traumatic coping mechanisms as a result of trauma, and it's unconscious, then you could be living in a very with a lot of discord and not in harmony with people. But bringing awareness to those kind of dynamics is what allows one to kind of at least free yourself to some extent. And I think at a societal level, just understanding that we're, so all of this separation stuff, I think is rooted in fear and anxiety, right? Like survival anxiety. And so if we're unconsciously being kind of emotionally hijacked and we're saying, no, like rush forward, rush into the technological program, rush to progress, like to these quick fixes. To me, the problem seems to be a lack of being able to step back and ground oneself and see what's going on. So if we could move into the future through raising awareness, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, and awareness of what is the question? Because the technological program of control, which we're seeing in our current time with COVID-19, but not just for COVID, for pretty much any crisis that we face, our default response is to find something to control, to become even more the lords and possessors of nature. The response of find something to control, find something to fight, find something to dominate, that is built into the conception of self that modernity offers to us. The self that is separate from each other and the collective human self that is separate from nature, that then sees the world in terms of competitors and enemies, and therefore sees well-being as a progressive victory over those competitors and enemies, for example, microbes. And as well sees human progress. It's not just competitors, it's also the random, indifferent, whimsical forces of nature that have no purpose and no intelligence in and of themselves. The mind of modernity actually denies what I just said, that nature has an innate tendency toward greater and greater life and complexity, and sees the evident increase in life and complexity as a sequence of accidents, of random fluctuations of atoms and void that give the appearance of increasing life and complexity, but that could change overnight. We've gotten lucky, and if we want to stay in a world of life and complexity, we have to control things because we're always on the verge of chaos. So in that mindset, order and control are equated with good, and chaos is evil. Lack of control is dangerous. that wouldn't make sense if there is a larger intelligence that includes us, that encompasses all of life. And because then we don't have to, in order for the world to become more and more beautiful, we no longer have to control the world. We can instead participate in the unfolding of that beauty and listen for what our role is in the next stage of that unfolding. And we can become allies of the world and not opponents of the world, seeking to conquer it to improve our lot. So that's I would call that a mythological level. What is the nature of the universe? That needs to change if our civilization is going to do anything different on Earth than we've been doing. That's the awareness. The awareness you're talking about, I think it's an awareness of who are we really, and what actually is the nature of this reality, and what is our relationship to other beings in it.
Yeah, I think the story that we're kind of currently fed of being these egos, these kinds of these identities riding around in this kind of meat suit in a universe that's fundamentally indifferent to us. I think more and more, I think that comes from a certain kind of a belief one might hold, but it's not borne out by science. I think we'd probably be in agreement that the scientific picture of the world, is not one in which there is something that we could even call a self that exists inside this body, but instead that the conception of self is a psychological process that is very flexible, right? We tend to kind of identify with ourselves, but then you write about kind of cultures where someone wouldn't say that even if they're physically healthy, they wouldn't say they're healthy if their sister was unwell, because their conception of self includes the community. And you make this great analogy to saying, it's like saying, I'm healthy, but my liver has cancer, but I'm healthy, and I think that's a powerful way of understanding how flexible the sense of self can be. And in spiritual states, especially well attested to in kind of Buddhism and ancient Hinduism, you can feel yourself to identify with all of existence, right? With the kind of totality of everything. And so I think this is, you in your work, there's a lot of kind of reference to this kind of spirituality. Taoism as well, I think, is something that seems to resonate with both of us, this idea that the world is a fundamental whole where kind of the spiritual aspects of reality are immanent in all of nature, rather than this kind of split between the kind of lowly material world and an elevated divine world.
Yeah, that's right. You raised that analogy that I had made about, well, yeah, my liver is sick, but I'm fine. That's just my liver. And I use that to point out, if our sense of self, as you were saying, if it includes something beyond what modernity calls the self, which is the skin-encapsulated ego, or the economic man making rational, self-interested choices, or the biological phenotype maximizing reproductive self-interest, et cetera, that's the modern self. But when we expand it beyond that to include, say, the planet, or to include the society that you're in, to include all people on Earth, then you cannot be healthy. You understand that you cannot be healthy if the Amazon is burning. You cannot be healthy if there are people living in poverty and misery, which is an understanding that is arising strongly now in the form of the climate, anti-climate change movement, Extinction Rebellion, and so forth. Like, it's informed by a basic understanding that our well-being is inseparable from the well-being of the world. I think that our understanding of that principle is still very rudimentary, because it's not so simple as, if we kill the Amazon, if we destroy nature, then we're going to die. What it really means is that if we do those things, something dies within ourselves. It doesn't mean that, this is the concept of interbeing, as it's called in Buddhism. It doesn't mean that if there are people languishing in abject poverty in Nairobi or Lagos or Bangladesh that you're going to be poor someday too. It means you're already poor in some way. An unequal society, even in an unequal society, even the wealthy cannot really be wealthy because their position requires constant vigilance to prevent the poor from getting their stuff. Like you can't, real wealth is feeling at home in the world. Real wealth is feeling of belonging. Real wealth is the absolute freedom to be generous without concern, without worry. But if you're seeing poor people around, or you're conscious of your privilege in respect to the poor people, then you can never actually fully be at ease, because if you're generous and you give it all away, you're going to be one of the poor peoples. So that's the sense, that's how interbeing operates. That's how this larger sense of self operates. It's not, I better be nice to nature, otherwise bad things will happen to me. It's that what is happening to nature is happening to me. What's happening to other people is happening to me. I cannot be whole as long as this is happening. Therefore, the improvement of my well-being requires the improvement of the world. And what I give to the world, I am also giving to myself. It's not even so much that it comes back to me. It's that even through the act of giving, it already enriches me. And this is hard to reconcile with our lived experience in a market economy where if you give it all away, if you let yourself get taken advantage of, like you're gonna, nothing good comes of that. If you're in trust, when you get the email saying that, the widow of a Nigerian prince wants to send you $5 million, and you trust that, like it's not going to end well. So this is not just a figment of our philosophical imagination that we live in a world of separation. We have built systems around that story of separation that then make that story true. So the systems actually create the story, and the story creates the systems. And together they're this gestalt. They're like this wholeness that is a being in its own, and a state of being, and a state of society that goes through an evolution, and in our time is reaching its maximum, and in fact has already entered its decrepitude. Like it's not robust anymore. The story of separation, the story of conquest, the bursting through one frontier after another to dominate nature, like that was exciting 2 generations ago. Everyone believed in it. Like you could wholeheartedly believe in it and draw meaning in life from exercising your role in this grand conquest of nature and of other cultures. Like that, because you were going to improve them too. That's no longer a source of meaning in modern societies. And we are therefore in a desperate search for meaning right now, which is one reason why, fascist political ideologies are becoming popular, and conspiracy theories and all these other ways that we can at least temporarily derive some meaning and some identity through participation in these offerings, in these stories. But I don't think that we've really come to a true one yet.
Yeah, and both of those you mentioned, fascism and conspiracy theories, they both scratch the itch of control, I guess. Fascism is obviously all about heavy-handed control, and conspiracy theories, I think, are about giving yourself the feeling of narrative control, like believing you know what's going on, even if
Yes.
You can't possibly. But so we've mentioned a few times, we've mentioned Buddhism, and I think there's this, you were saying that we can't pinpoint a particular moment that was the thing that went wrong for humanity with this trajectory of separation. But language does seem to be something that, the correlation between us having language and our incredible technological, powers of coordination and the kind of runaway freight train of civilization seems to be a huge kind of feature of this process. And the wisdom in meditation is often you can understand in terms of realizing that the language is often this tied up with, I guess, anxious planning for the future, and suffering is comes about through the sense of self and linguistic thought about what one wants to do in the world, and relaxing that can allow you to move into being. Do you see that as a strong connection in your work?
Yeah. The world of concepts that is embodied in language has its purpose, and it's a powerful tool for creation. However, when we get lost in that universe of concepts, then we can no longer use the tool intentionally. So I think it's really important to take breaks from conceptual thought and from language, which, that's one thing that meditation can offer, to ground us in a reality that's prior to the presentations of conceptual thought, which when you get lost in them, they seem very real, and you might forget that they are ultimately just concepts. Actually, that's not quite accurate. I don't want to say that they're just concepts, because reality organizes itself around our concepts. At first, maybe it's just a projection of meaning and order onto the world. But when we live into that projection, then we create order and meaning around the concepts. So it's not so much that one world is real and one is not real, but it is like meditation and other practices, other body practices, for example, can be an anchor to another reality that is prior to the reality of concepts. Because obviously concepts are language. Where do they come from? Originally they came from pre-linguistic people who developed language. For what reason? This is a mystery in linguistics. Why did people start using language? There's all kinds of theories to coordinate the hunt or something like that. None of them seem very compelling to me. The only one that seems compelling to me is that it evolved as a game. And the first use of it was to tell stories, not for some practical purpose that enhances our survival. Like, can we stop seeing everything in terms of whether it enhances survival or not? People do so many things that are not useful for survival, like playing music. That doesn't help you survive, but people do it in every corner of the earth. So that's I guess one of the conceptual lenses that then organizes reality around it. Because when we see the world as a contest for survival, then we create systems that reify that. For example, capitalism, where it is everyone is out there trying to get the best deal for themselves. And then having built that system and living in that system, it seems that its description of human nature is true, that everybody is trying to get the best deal. Every time you shop online and you compare prices, you are doing that. So it looks real, but is that actually human nature? Or is that a product of those circumstances? So anyway, I'm just kind of illustrating the complexity of the relationship between concept and reality. Yeah.
And do you think the link to separation, I guess the way I would think about it is that, if you stop thinking with language and you just exist, you do have these kinds of states of feeling that are you kind of a reunion with the rest of reality, because concepts tend to kind of divide the world up and categorize the world, and especially the concept of the self, it produces separation because concepts are fundamentally about division. Does that resonate with the way you think about it?
Yeah. And so maybe you go back into that state, that preconceptual state, and you have access to something true that was obscured by the shifting maze of concepts. And then from that state, you're like, okay, now I want to go back into the world of concepts and use them to enact this truth that I have seen. So that, it's not that once we realize that life is just a big drama, that we no longer condescend to participate in that drama. But we recognize maybe what is that drama really for? Maybe we had gotten lost in a drama that was horrible and ugly and wasn't moving toward a satisfying plot resolution. And so, or maybe we realized we weren't playing our role very well in that drama, and that if we played our role better, it could go in a much more beautiful direction. So we don't stay then in the nirvana state. We don't stay outside of concepts and outside of the game, but we take the realization from that state back into the game. I mean, this is the bodhisattva vow, essentially, because the game isn't bad. Things are possible by playing that game that are desirable, and the game itself can be beautiful. It's just like like if you're an actor and you're in a play, and then maybe the performance is finished and you were really lost in your role in that performance. The character took you over completely, and in that moment, maybe in the deep recesses of your mind, that you're not actually Othello, but in that moment, you are fully in character. And then the play is over, you step out of it, and you're like, oh yeah, actually, I'm Charles, I'm not Othello. But you don't say, oh, therefore I'm never going to act in a play again. You then take on the next role. So humanity collectively, we are awakening from the drama that we had been totally immersed in, that had taken a pretty bad turn, that had carried us to a place where we lost touch with fundamental truths about the world, about reality, about being human. And now we're kind of waking up to the fact that, hey, actually, this was just a story. This was a play. This was a drama, and we were all playing roles in it. And now we realize that. And we're coming now, more and more of us, into contact with the non-dual world, with the preconceptual world, through all kinds of experiences and realizations. And that doesn't mean that, we're never going to go back into story again, and symbol and representation and science and technology, et cetera, we're going to exit the world. No, we're going to say, okay, what's the next story that we will participate in? What's the next role that we are going to play? And everyone can ask themselves that question too. Given the knowledge that is awakening in me, how do I play a good role? And maybe we remember, sometimes it's good to touch back into a prior reality to make sure that we're playing our role well. And we can only know if we're playing our role well, and if the game itself is beautiful, if we look at it from outside the role and from outside the game. So that's the utility of what we call spiritual practices, which, and I think we can rehabilitate the word spirituality in this way because when it takes on connotations of otherworldliness, it can end up desacralizing the world. Because if the sacred is to be found in the spiritual, then the worldly becomes profane. And we end up treating the world as a profanity. And we engage in what is essentially sacrilegious behavior toward nature. So that version of spirituality is quite bankrupt. But when we understand this otherworldliness as a reconnection to a prior, then it can exercise a really powerful positive effect on our worldly affairs.
Right. And you mentioned that kind of split between, I guess, heaven and earth, of the material on the one hand and the spiritual on the other. And a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, a few writers, I guess, attribute agriculture to be the kind of the moment it really went wrong, because it's the kind of embodiment of all of this anxious forward planning, right? That comes along with language of sacrifice today, so you can reap what you sowed tomorrow. But then you also write about the idea that with agriculture, that was such an important step of us pulling away from the natural world, trying to control it, and that along with that comes this change in spirituality of seeing, as with something like Taoism, seeing God or spirit as being synonymous with nature, through to this view of a detached, I guess, kind of separated God from a lowly material world.
Yeah, that has a lot to do. I mean, it has something to do with agriculture at a fundamental level, but it has a lot more to do with what arose from agriculture, especially mass agriculture, and hierarchical societies, division of labor, social classes, the concept of ownership. These things evolved over thousands of years. It wasn't like somebody all of a sudden got this bad idea. Let's start domesticating. Hey, I have an idea, like two cavemen. Hey, Og, I've got an idea. Let's, instead of living in harmony and participation in nature, let's dominate nature instead and plant crops and master the animals, and build cities and have slaves and turn women into property. And the other caveman says, yeah, good idea. But that's not how it happened. It evolved imperceptibly, slowly, where the cultivation of grains started with maybe annual visits to grain-rich areas where they were growing naturally, and then maybe over time you come into a symbiosis with these grains, and you end up, in relationship to them, and you end up, at first undigested grains come out in your poop, and they grow better, and then eventually maybe you start pooping in the very best spots, and eventually, like over centuries or thousands of years, it turns into horticulture. Same thing with animal domestication. It starts with maybe annually going to where the animals are in great numbers, and then eventually maybe you follow them around, and then eventually you come into relationship with them. You protect them from predators, perhaps. So it happened over thousands of years. Same thing with all the other aspects of civilization. So because it happened so organically, and because it happened independently on so many places on Earth, I think we have to say that it was inevitable. Pretty much anywhere agriculture could have happened, it happened. The places where it never happened just didn't have domesticable plants and animals. Like Australia. Like you really couldn't do agriculture there. Which is fortunate for humanity, actually, because over the 50,000 or 80,000 years that humans have been in Australia, they developed in other directions, other kinds of technologies that are not dependent on what comes from agriculture, which is division of labor. Like division of labor because of, agricultural surplus, that allows the development of what we recognize today as technology, because it requires specialization and so forth. Other long-lasting cultures developed kinds of technology that do not depend on this division of labor. The Australian Aborigines have, they developed, for example, technologies of dream that I don't think have really fully been delivered to the world yet. But ultimately, they will be as important to the next stage of human development as, electronics are.
Moving forward into the future, you've written about this idea of a story of interbeing and reunion as being the kind of thing that would replace the stories of separation and ascent. Perhaps would you be able to kind of encapsulate what that would look like to someone who's not heard it before?
Yeah. So interbeing, a term coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody else thought of it too, though, because it's such a natural term. It's the successor, I see, to the story of the separate self. So instead of a Cartesian mote of consciousness in a flesh robot, the self becomes interconnected, interdependent, interexistent. The self becomes a nexus of relationship that includes the relationship. It's not just the nexus point, but it's the totality of the relationships radiating out from that nexus point, which means that it is actually unique because that totality of relationships looks different from another nexus point. So we have interconnection and, in a sense, a kind of a unity, but we also have difference. So then I earlier in our conversation, I elaborated about the story of interbeing, the understanding that what happens to the world, to any of these relationships, happens to me as well. And that another part of it is that the qualities of self, like consciousness, sentience, intelligence, are not only in human beings, but that they are fundamental properties of the world. And this is all indigenous people, as far as I know, believe this, recognize this, that we're not the only people, but animals are people too. Plants are, even stones, even the wind has an experience of being. And that the entirety of the world, or even the cosmos, also has an intelligence that's not less than human intelligence, but unfathomably more, that we can tap into and participate in. So that's what I would say is the successor story. And when we take that on, we understand, okay, we're not here then to impose intelligence on a world that has none without us. We are not here to stem the tide of chaos by domesticating all of reality and controlling it. Well, why are we here if there is an intelligence beyond ourselves? Obviously, we're here to contribute to it. We're here to contribute to life and beauty on Earth. And I think that if we reconceive technology in its purpose as being to contribute to life and beauty on Earth, then we have a new story, a new collective story from which we can derive meaning and identity and purpose. And we can totally transform civilization. And so the first stage of that is that we heal the damage that's been done over 5,000 years of separation. And when we are so powerful, we humans are so powerful. If we really turned our minds to that, if we collectively agreed on that and made that the object of our will, planetary healing, 10 years, the world will be transformed. You can see what happens in specific regenerative projects, land restoration projects. There are people doing it around the world, water retention landscapes and things like that. The Loess Plateau in China, they've through basically simple land feature contributions, like check dams, and swales and things like that, and trees planted in strategic places. Like the whole thing has come back to life, restored from the desert. There's, I think, the harbor I can't remember, it's in Australia somewhere, where they just simply protected it and maybe made a few. It's not to retreat from nature and let nature heal by itself. It's to take an active role in healing, in being an instrument of that healing. How can I serve the soil? How can I serve the water? That is, because if you say, well, nature would be better off without us, then there's no purpose for humanity. But do you really believe that we're just nature's big mistake? No, we are here to participate. Just like every other species, we're here to offer something that serves the unfolding of life and beauty. So that's what I call the new and ancient story. that can replace the story of conquest and domination and infuse our lives with meaning and give shape to our systems.
Yeah, I think that's really, so when thinking about how we move into this new story, your work really has the kind of wisdom of non-attachment woven through it, which I think is really important, but is probably a tricky thing to communicate alongside envisioning a future that we want to be a certain way, ideally, but then trying to move into it without strict control. So at the individual level, you kind of write about that we shouldn't, overlook the importance of the small acts that we do that come from a place of authenticity. It's not that we should be flagellating ourselves and exhausting ourselves, or becoming activists and pressuring each other in this frantic way to because all of that comes from the same program of separation and control. But then I guess maybe the flip side is it's kind of like an acceptance of the way everything's unfolding. It's all unfolding the way it has. It's all unfolding. It kind of in line with its own nature. Everything's going the way it's going to go. So do we have to reach some kind of natural crisis points before we're going to move into this new way of being, do you think?
I think we already are reaching a natural crisis point. A crisis point isn't a guarantee that we're going to move into a new way of being, though. But it offers us a choice. And the more acute the crisis, the more obvious it is that we face a choice. So I like to look also at where does the courage come from to make a more beautiful choice? And how do we create conditions for that? When everything falls apart, we could go into, like, say there's a big economic collapse. Do we go into a solidarity economy, or do we go into warlordism? Why does one society go one direction and another go another direction? And how can we create the conditions for the more beautiful choice? And that can come down to a billion interpersonal interactions. The more generosity and compassion and kindness in those interactions, the stronger the wellspring of solidarity is. So these personal actions do have political significance. They're not meant to replace traditional political action. There's a role for what you were calling anxious planning, or at least planning. The anxious part comes from thinking that you always have to have a plan, otherwise you're not going to get anything done. But there are, I'm sure that you and probably everybody listening has had those moments where you have a sense that there is a plan and you don't know what it is, but you know exactly what to do at each given moment, which feels very different from just randomly striking about not knowing what to do. Like you feel the necessity and purpose of these choices, even though you're not fully aware of what the plan is. And then sometimes you do have a plan. Plans are useful when you know exactly what you want and you know exactly how to get there. Then you make a plan. However, right now our situation is not of that kind. We maybe have a dim idea of what we want, but we have no idea how to get there. There is no practical plan to get there. What's practical is that nothing's going to change. What's practical is that the political changes that are necessary would be considered completely unrealistic. And a politician would say, yeah, I agree with you, that would be great, but there's no way that that's practical. So there is no practical plan to get to a more beautiful world. But we know that there actually is a way to get to a more beautiful world. Maybe this is my personal prejudice, but I do not think that the way is that we get the very smartest people to make the very best plan. And then they unveil that to everybody and they say, here's the plan. And everyone says, oh, that's so brilliant. Yes, I'm going to completely change my views of the world because I'm just bowled over by the brilliance of your plan. But a lot of people seem to think that that's the way to go, especially guys like me, who sit alone in their parents' basement. Okay, this is a dramatization of me. Okay, they sit alone in their parents' basement thinking, and they come up with the plan. And then they're like, okay, I am a genius and I've made the plan to save humanity. And it involves this kind of economy and this kind of money system and this kind of, and I've got the whole thing. Here's the blueprint. Now, step 2, now that I've thought of the plan, is to go convince everybody. Well, soon you run up to another smart guy in his parents' basement who also came up with the plan, but it's a different plan. So then you have to fight it out. And what you end up with is a lot of really smart people fighting it out. And no one even pays very much attention to them. But maybe they get a small following. And, it's you have like these sects that have been around for 100 years sometimes or more, like the social credit sect or the Georgist economics sect. And they've been carrying forth this plan for a really long time. And then it's not that these ideas are impotent. They can have an effect. But we have to understand that we cannot plan our way out of this. Instead, we have to recognize opportunities and be open and flexible to respond to those opportunities with an action that might have been part of a plan, and maybe it wasn't, because maybe we didn't understand the world and its causes as well as we thought we did. I can pretty much guarantee that each one of us someday is going to say, wow, I really did not understand how reality operates. Especially because a lot of our understanding is based on the causality that the story of separation offers to us, which is a causality of forces operating on masses. And that does not admit to choice. Non-deterministic choice, acausal choice, does not admit to emergence, does not admit to non-force-based causality, does not admit to teleological principles. None of that. It's our Newtonian intuitions are really obsolete, but they still govern a lot of our civilization.
And so maybe maybe possibly optimistic place to end on would be the idea that to move into a kind of a better world, that instead of us having to reach some kind of rock bottom point where we really have a choice. Part of me is optimistic that the progress we're seeing in psychedelic medicine could change enough individuals in the direction of wanting this kind of this new narrative, that we could see the kind of choice point on the horizon and perhaps avert it. Do you have any optimism around that?
I think that I think more in terms of, maybe we do have to hit rock bottom, but what is rock bottom? I think that if you look at addiction, what's rock bottom for one person might not be anywhere near bottom for somebody else. For one person, rock bottom might be, that their spouse walks out on them, and that's hitting bottom. And then, they might even get back together with their spouse after 3 days of that, and they don't use again. For another person, they're still smoking through their tracheostomy hole as they're on their deathbed, and they don't hit rock bottom until they're in the death process itself. So I think the question then is, how do we raise bottom so that there's another life on the other side of the crisis? Because I don't think we can avoid a dissolution. Something has to dissolve the story that we are in and the ossified systems that surround that story. Something has to dissolve that. If we are ready for that to happen, then we're not going to try too hard to keep it together. We're going to let go. And so what creates that readiness? What creates the courage to let go? I think that it is a feeling of safety, a feeling of love, a feeling of belonging. It's a zeitgeist of compassion, that whether or not you have a big voice or politically engaged or have a big plan, like every single person can contribute to this field of compassion, of peace, of healing, where we can look at ourselves and be like, yeah, how much of me wants to dominate somebody and make the world better that way by triumphing over an enemy? And maybe that's one of those stories that we can get lost in, and that takes on a life of its own, and that motivates the worst atrocities, all in the name of good. Like, we can see where that goes, and so how much of that is in me, and how willing am I right now to choose a path of peace, to ask of those I judge, what is it actually like to be you? Apart from my judgments that you're a shitty person, like, what happened to you to make you act in a way that looks like you're a shitty person? Like, to look for the conditions of what we judge, so that maybe then we can address the conditions. Maybe we can see people as on this journey from, as I said before, from like a particular depth of separation back home. And then do we blame them for having been born into that depth of separation? Do we make the problem them and their bad choices? Or do we honor their journey back? Because when we honor their journey back, we actually assist the journey back. It feels so good to be seen in the things that no one else saw. So this is a way that we can aid each other on this collective journey back and raise bottom, so that we have another life on the other side of this inevitable dissolving of the world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that worldview. Well, thank you so much, Charles. This has been wonderful. Is there somewhere you would direct people to if they want to look into your work more?
Oh, my website.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff there. Yeah. Thank you, James. Yeah. Hope I was not too talkative. I kind of went off on some pretty long rants there.
That's why I got you on.
Okay.
All right.
That's good. Yeah. Thanks.